This story was first told in 1998 by a journalist named Martins Agbonlahor, and it featured in both the American magazine Fate that same year and the 2005 book Ghost Stories from Around the World Volume 1. The events Mr. Agbonlahor wrote about took place in 1990, at a time he was living with his father in Benin City, Nigeria. It was June, and he was at home from university looking ahead to what he called another boring weekend at home. During these downtimes from his studies, Martins and his friends, to make money, would drive through the streets of Benin City looking for passengers and to offer them a lift at a cheap price. The popular practice, especially among young drivers, was known as kabubu and served people who may not be able to afford a regular taxi fare. However, it was something his father did not approve of, and if Martins was ever caught taxiing, the strict disciplinarian would punish him. But this June day in 1990 was Martin's father's 75th birthday, and the old man was in high spirits, so Martin asked him if he could borrow his car. To his surprise, his father agreed, on the condition he return by dusk. Martins headed to the amusement park and then to the zoo. He enjoyed himself so much that day that he was going to cancel his taxi plans and just savour the freedom before returning the car. That was until he heard music and voices coming from a venue nearby. Thinking there must be a party going on, his thoughts of heading home changed, and the opportunity to make a little money became too appealing to resist. By the time he arrived at the venue, the party was over, and the revellers were gathered outside, waiting for rides home. Then, from the large crowd, emerged a beautiful woman. She approached the car and requested a ride home, offering young Martins 400 naira for his services. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. She got into the car and introduced herself as Stella. Martins said that, apart from her beauty, there was nothing unusual about her, but as the journey went on, she would occasionally ask him to stop the car so she could get out. She would do so and then wave at open spaces at the side of the road, as if she were greeting imaginary people. Although he thought it bizarre, the young driver put it down to the alcohol she must have consumed that night. They had been travelling for around 90 minutes when Stella again asked Martins to pull over at a sharp bend in the road. She quickly got out of the car and asked him to wait while she fetched the promised fare. There were no buildings in sight. It looked like a sheer wasteland, and by this time it was very dark. After a few minutes of waiting, Martins picked up his torch and exited the vehicle. He walked out into the night and turned on his torch. At the side of the road he could make out a sign. It read, "Area Cemetery, do not trespass." From beyond the sign he heard a guttural laugh. He shone his torch in that direction to see Stella sitting atop a tombstone. She laughed again and reached out what looked like a dead, withered arm. Martins, now weak from fear, said he recalled the local stories that he had heard over the years about sacred places and the dead returning to the living world. He said that his head became very heavy and his limbs weak as he tried to make his way back to the car, but everything by now was a frightening blur and he fell to the ground. He said that he woke up in a hospital the next day. A good Samaritan had found him unconscious in the road that afternoon under the hot sun. Placed on his head was a paltry sum of 10 naira. The young man was at a complete loss with no recollection of the night before. That was until his father called upon a local herbalist, who he requested go to his son immediately. The herbalist brought out a hot concoction, began rubbing it into Martin's skin, and asked, "What really happened to you, son?" He then offered Martins a drink of the same remedy which he took. After more than an hour, Martins began to remember the night's events. After he recounted everything to his father and the herbalist, the two men made their way to the cemetery where they performed an exorcism-like ritual. On the edge of the cemetery they found a tomb with the epitaph, "In loving memory of Miss Stella Karoa, 1949 to 1988. The car was still there, so Martin's father drove it home. The following day, Martins travelled 1,200 miles to stay with his aunt while he recovered, pondered, and came to terms with his experience that Saturday night in June of 1990. After reading this unbelievable story, I contacted Martins Agbon Lahore, who now resides in Manchester, England, to ask him if there was any truth at all to the story. Within an hour, he replied to my email. He wrote, "Thanks for reaching out. Yes, that strange experience is true indeed. This life is pregnant with unexplained mysteries, unfortunately. Take care and be good to your neighbours. Martins." This next story was mentioned in the Dublin Evening Telegraph on July the 11th, 1887. The newspaper claims that the story is told by a retired American soldier named John. He recalls a series of events from the time of the American Civil War when he was stationed at what he called Fort William on Governor's Island in New York Harbour, although the building is now better known as Castle Williams. He said, "It was over 20 years ago. I was a sergeant at the time, married, and with my young wife, had been living in a small house on the lower end of the island." John goes on to say that his commanding officer at the time wanted the house torn down to make way for other constructions, so the soldier and his wife were forced to move into temporary quarters in the unoccupied fort. He said by the time nightfall came on the day of the big move, he had been extremely tired and slept deeply that first night in the new dwelling. His wife was worn out too, although she did not sleep so soundly that night, nor did she for the next few nights. She had complained of a noise that she had heard every night and described it as just like thunder. "I paid little attention to her," John explained. "I thought it was only the sound of passing steamboats or the wash of water on the shore. It wasn't until they had been in their new home within Fort William for 2 weeks that John was forced to take his wife's nightly complaints seriously. He awoke one night with a feeling of dread, an overwhelming unease that he couldn't shake. 'John, do you hear it now?' his wife exclaimed when she discovered he was awake. 'It sounds like some person's at work below.' John recognised the familiar sounds. He said, 'Had I not been positive that the doors were locked with the keys hanging on a nail in my room, I would have sworn that the batteries were being manned by experienced gunners.' The cannons used to defend New York's harbour rang out, and along with the screeching of their wheels over steel rails, John said the sounds were perfect in every way. The only thing missing were the yells of command." John goes on, "As I listened, the uproar increased in volume until it was impossible to hear each other's voices without raising them to a high pitch. The guns were served with what seemed like incredible rapidity, and the very walls, as massive as they were, trembled under the heavy artillery." Unable to stand it any longer, John rose from his bed, lit his lamp, grabbed his keys and a revolver, and headed down the steps of the fort. At this point, he said, the sounds of war were even more deafening. It slowly quietened as he neared the door. He unlocked it, and with his gun cocked and lantern in the other hand, he entered the now quiet circular fort grounds, checking each battery room of the building as he walked around the inner walls. The cannons and artillery were in place, but it was completely unoccupied. Tired and confused, John returned to his wife in bed. The story goes on that the ghostly commotion continued the next night and almost every night for the next 4 weeks, according to our storyteller. He said that when he and his wife spoke about the incidents to other soldiers and their families, they were always met with ridicule and accused of fabricating the story in order to be moved to better living quarters. John vowed that he would have more witnesses the next time it happened, and it didn't take long. One night, during the ghostly commotion, John left his room and crossed the drawbridge into the men's quarters, where he awoke a sergeant by the name of Smith. Now Smith at first refused to be dragged from his bed in the dead of night to entertain a ridiculous story about a ghost army, but John, out of sheer frustration, insisted Sergeant Smith accompany him. As both men stood at the door leading to the internal castle grounds, John watched as Sergeant Smith shook with fear as they both listened to the phantom echoes of war. John then threw the door open. As before, the sound stopped, and there was nothing to be seen but the moonlit courtyard. However, a dismayed-looking Sergeant Smith swore that, for a second, he had seen the dark figures of men at their battlements. I'll end with a realization that John tells us about to close his story. He says that some months after leaving the island, he found out that during the American-Mexican War of 1846 to 1848, which was some 20 years before John's experience, an artillery company used these guns in drills before they left for Mexico, and that they were nearly all killed in battle. John ended by saying, "They must have had their reunion within these casements, and practiced with their old friends, the guns." This is English author Gerald Findler. In his 1969 book, Ghosts of Lake Counties, he wrote about his experience as a young orderly at a military hospital at the end of World War I. He was working with the Royal Army Medical Corps at an auxiliary medical centre based at a primary school in Carlisle, England. Findler states that there weren't many injured soldiers there, but he had the job of making sure that they were comfortable and that all their needs were met. During his time there, he answered to an Irish nurse named Sister Cherry. It was 1917, Gerald Findler recalls. One of the injured soldiers at the centre was an Australian man he referred to only as Chase, and according to Gerald Findler, he was a sergeant. Sergeant Chase had suffered severe back injuries, and he was housed within a small hut at the far end of the school playground. Every night the young Mr. Findler would cross the playground, step into the hut, fire up the oil lamp at Sergeant Chase's bedside, and read to him until he fell asleep. One night, as Gerald stepped out of the main ward to make his way over to the sergeant, he noticed that the lamp was already shining through the window of the hut. When Gerald entered, he saw an old man sitting with the sergeant, holding his hand. The young orderly apologised, said that he would be back later, and left. When he returned to the ward and told Sister Cherry about the old man, she said that visiting time had ended hours ago, and that no visitors were admitted at this time of night. Both Gerald and Sister Cherry crossed the playground, and as they approached the hut, they could see through the window, in the light of the oil lamp, the old man was still sitting with Sergeant Chase. When they entered, the light went out. Fumbling around in the darkness, Gerald relit the lamp. The old man was gone, and Sergeant Chase lay motionless. He was dead. When his body was taken to the main ward and his belongings gathered, several photographs were found inside his wallet. One of them was of his father, the man Gerald Findler swears he saw beside Sergeant Chase's bed earlier that night. Now, I've always said that regardless of whether you believe in ghosts or not, ghost stories should be treated as just that, stories, and enjoyed as such. That said, I always do a little research on the names and places mentioned to try to give some credence to the alleged events, regardless of how unbelievable they may sound. So the following, I suppose, is for the hardcore believers in the paranormal. As mentioned at the beginning of the segment, this story was originally told by Gerald Findler in his 1969 book, Ghosts of Lake Counties. In it, he says that Mr. Chase was a sergeant from Australia who died in 1917 and whose grave now lies within Carlisle Cemetery. When I investigated this, the only Chase war grave I found at the Carlisle Cemetery was that of Corporal Leonard Chase of the Australian Imperial Forces, who died on the 1st of September 1918. It seems likely that this is the man the author is referring to in his story, albeit a couple of the particulars are wrong, namely the date of death and the military ranking. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission website states that Leonard Chase's mother and father were Lucy Edith Chase and Herbert Lucas Chase of Toorak Gardens, Adelaide, Australia. The July 2nd, 1921 edition of the Adelaide Chronicle newspaper features Herbert Lucas Chase's obituary. It says that he passed away on the 23rd of June 1921. Herbert Lucas Chase died 3 years after his son. So assuming that Gerald Findler was telling the truth about what he saw that night during World War I, and that he was correct in identifying Leonard Chase's father from a photo in his wallet, that would make this a story of astral projection of a living man visiting his son in his last moments, rather than a classic ghost story. It's always interesting to find a newspaper story of a haunting from the latter part of the 20th century or beyond. Newspapers have rarely printed such stories in recent years. If I go to the British Newspaper Archive, for example, and set my search filters to anything beyond the 1970s, the word ghost or haunting will show me little more than cinema and television listings of horror movies, or a sports report about a team or athlete who, quote, gave up the ghost following their latest contest. Modern-day ghost stories do appear occasionally, but they are rarely worth covering. That said, various Scottish newspapers, including the Fife Free Press and the Courier and Advertiser, featured a story in January of 1994 about a man named Mark Anderson and his fiancée Leah Livingstone, and what they experienced at Mark's home in Kirkcaldy, Fife, Scotland. The events that took place at number 45 Sutherland Place over a 5-month period led to Mr. Anderson begging the district council to find him a new home. The 20-year-old pet shop worker moved into the one-bedroom flat in September of 1993. From then until January of the following year, he said that he and 17-year-old Leah had experienced sudden drops in temperature, the ringing of phantom bells, things going missing and loud footsteps. All activity was localised to the bedroom. After a few months, things progressed to loud dragging sounds on the bedroom carpet and the tugging and rustling of the bed sheets, which would wake them in the middle of the night. Mark said that one night when he was alone, it felt as if someone or something was pulling the sheets away from him. It was as if there was someone in the bed beside me, he said. Leah Livingstone, who lived in nearby Glenmore Gardens, was with Mark on the night of Sunday the 9th of January 1994 when things escalated. It was the early hours of Monday morning when she woke up with the feeling that she was being held down in the bed by a force she could not see. Then at around 4:20 a.m, Mark's ghetto blaster, which he says was switched off at the mains, started blaring music. When Mark switched the mains on and then off again, it stopped. But that dark, cold January morning had one more event in store for the already petrified couple. They were lying awake when they saw, at the end of the bed, a white human-like figure standing in the darkness. It remained there for a few seconds before turning away and disappearing. Later that morning, Mark Anderson walked out of the flat, moved into Leah's parents' home and promised never to return. The district council stated that they sympathised with Mark and invited him to apply for a transfer. Mr. Anderson came under fire from the public, who said that the story was simply a ruse to be given a bigger flat, but Mark Anderson emphatically stated that had it not been for the eerie goings-on, he would have remained. He said, "I was happy there. It's a really nice flat in a good, quiet area, and I have spent a lot of money on it." Amidst the accusations that Mark Anderson was simply lying in order to be rehomed, the former occupant of the flat, David Coxon, came to his defence. He said that he too had experienced similar phenomena over the 5 years he had lived at the Sutherland Place property. Coxon said, "It's a thing you never really speak about, because if you did, people would think you're a nutter. It's a shame this guy's getting so much bother. With me, it was just a case of feeling a presence and being woken up, sometimes by a feeling like a ton of weight was on top of me. There must be something there. I don't know what, but I have never had that feeling before or since." Following Mark Anderson's sudden exit from the home, the local council sent in a psychic investigator named Helen Walters. She spent some time at the property and claimed that there were as many as 5 spirits present, including a Victorian couple and a middle-aged man. Helen claimed that one of the male spirits was at times verbally abusive, but all in all, none of them were a threat. Despite this, Mark refused to return. Even when a spokesperson for the Fife Council publicly offered to get someone to exorcise the spirits, Mark said, "They can have their exorcism if they want, but after all this I will not be able to sleep in there again, and neither will Leah." I'm unsure if the exorcism went ahead, but sometime after Mark moved out, he said that his neighbour approached him one day and asked him if he had moved back in because he could hear the television at night. Other neighbours and a local taxi driver said that they had seen lights flickering in the empty flat as if coming from a television, and Mark returned to the flat on occasion while living with Leah's parents to find that the lights had been switched on. These details mean very little when all is considered. As it was a council home, someone else may have had access to it, but at the time it all worked to further fuel a story about a haunted flat. As a footnote to this story, there was a haunting reported in September of 1958 by a family named Forsyth who lived just over half a mile away from Sutherland Place at 17 Oak Tree Square. Kirkcaldy Member of Parliament Thomas Hubbard spent a night in the house, and after experiencing nothing unusual, he said that the whole thing was nonsense. Despite this, the family were rehomed. 14 years later, in November of 1972, a family of 7 who were living at number 18 Oak Tree Square fled their home in the middle of the night following a series of alleged supernatural incidents. I may look at the hauntings of 17 and 18 Oak Tree Square in a later video. That's it. Good lad.